Mary Williams, a woman in her early 60s, had weathered the storms of life with quiet dignity. Her skin, a deep brown marked by age and hardship, spoke of years of hard work and perseverance. Her graying hair, always tied back in a tight bun, symbolized the discipline and determination that had carried her through life. For over a decade, she had worked as a housekeeper at the Harrington family estate, a sprawling mansion in an affluent neighborhood of Connecticut. The mansion, with its stately red brick exterior and sprawling lawns, was a testament to the wealth and power of the Harringtons. Inside, the high ceilings and marble floors echoed with the footsteps of a family who rarely acknowledged Mary's presence. Mary's daily routine involved cleaning rooms that were bigger than her entire apartment, dusting antiques that cost more than she earned in a year, and preparing meals she could never afford. Yet, despite her hard work, she felt invisible. To the Harringtons, she was just part of the scenery, there to serve, never to be seen. Richard Harrington, the head of the family, was a self-made millionaire with a reputation for ruthless business dealings. He had built an empire in real estate, and his name was synonymous with power. His wife, Catherine, was his perfect counterpart, elegant, with an icy demeanor that matched her perfectly coiffed blonde hair. Catherine never hesitated to remind Mary of her place, barking orders in clipped tones, never making eye contact, and often criticizing her work in front of guests. "Mary, you missed a spot on the mirror," Catherine would say, her voice sharp as glass. "I expect better, especially for what we pay you." Mary would nod silently, wiping the same spot over and over, even if it was already spotless. She had learned long ago that talking back would only make things worse. Every day felt like a reminder of how small her world had become. But beneath her calm exterior, Mary harbored a painful secret, one that connected her to this family in ways they could never imagine. Catherine Harrington was the embodiment of privilege. Her life revolved around charity galas, designer clothes, and high society luncheons where she was always the center of attention. To outsiders, she seemed like the perfect hostess, but behind closed doors, her cruelty knew no bounds, especially toward Mary. Catherine's sense of superiority was palpable, and Mary, a mere housekeeper, was often the target of her frustrations. "Why can't you do anything right, Mary?" Catherine's voice rang out one afternoon as she entered the grand dining room, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She stood there in her tailored dress, hands on her hips, glaring at Mary, who was setting the table for an upcoming dinner party. The silverware wasn't aligned to Catherine's impossibly high standards, and the flowers weren't arranged to her liking. Mary glanced up, but said nothing. Over the years, she had learned to absorb Catherine's insults with quiet grace, though each word chipped away at her self-worth. She adjusted the placement of the forks and rearranged the flowers, her hands steady despite the growing tension in the room. "I swear, I don't know why Richard insists on keeping you around," Catherine continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can't even handle simple tasks. People like you should be grateful to have a job like this." The weight of Catherine's words hung in the air. Mary kept her gaze down, her eyes focused on the delicate china plates, but inside, her heart was pounding. She had always done her best to keep her emotions in check, but there were moments, like this, when the anger simmered just below the surface. Still, she knew better than to show it. In this house, showing any sign of weakness or defiance would only lead to more trouble. As Catherine's tirade continued, Mary's mind drifted to the memories she had buried deep inside. She thought of the son she had lost so many years ago, the pain of that separation still fresh even after decades. She had come to work for the Harringtons to make a living, never imagining that fate would bring her so close to the child she had been forced to give up. Catherine had no idea who Mary really was, and for now, Mary intended to keep it that way. But every insult, every harsh word Catherine threw at her, was like a reminder of everything Mary had lost. And though she kept quiet, Mary knew that the truth could not stay hidden forever. Mary had always been good at keeping secrets. For years, she had buried her pain deep inside, never allowing it to surface, not even to herself. The memories were too painful, the loss too unbearable. She had lost her son when he was just a baby, taken from her by circumstances she could never fully control. It was a time in her life she tried not to think about, but every day, working in the Harrington mansion, she was reminded of the life she could have had with him. Little did the Harringtons know that their empire, their wealth, and their privilege were tied to a part of Mary's past they would never understand. Decades earlier, Mary had been a young mother, alone and struggling. Living in a tough part of New York City, she had tried to raise her son, but with no support and limited resources, the weight of the world had fallen on her shoulders. She remembered the day he was taken. Social services had deemed her unfit to care for him due to her financial struggles. She had fought for him, had begged them not to take him away, but her cries fell on deaf ears. She never saw her baby again. She never knew where he ended up, only that he had been adopted by a wealthy family. Now, every time she looked at Richard Harrington, her heart ached. The successful businessman, with his sharp suits and confident demeanor, was unknowingly her son. The son who had been raised in privilege, given everything she could never offer. But she couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. She had no proof, and the risk was too high. She feared what would happen if she revealed her secret. Would Richard reject her? Would the Harringtons fire her, leaving her once again with nothing? As she wiped down the gleaming kitchen counters, her hands slowed, and her thoughts drifted. She could still picture his tiny face, the way his small hand gripped hers before he was taken. That memory was all she had left. Every now and then, she would imagine what he looked like now. Did he have her eyes? Her smile? Working in the Harrington mansion, Mary had learned to observe Richard closely without ever revealing her emotions. She saw bits of herself in him, the way he smiled, the way he handled pressure. But the life he had built was far from the one Mary had imagined for him. He was surrounded by luxury, but there was a coldness in the Harrington household, a lack of warmth that Mary had always wished she could have provided him. And Catherine's cruelty only made it worse. Catherine had no idea that the woman she belittled and humiliated was Richard's mother. As Mary polished the last glass, she looked out of the large kitchen window, her reflection staring back at her. She had spent years running from her past, but now it seemed to be catching up with her. The question wasn't if she would reveal the truth, it was when. The Harrington mansion was always filled with the quiet hum of wealthy guests and important conversations. But on this particular afternoon, something shifted. Richard had invited two of his closest business partners, Michael and Sarah, over for a private discussion about an upcoming deal. As always, Catherine was playing the perfect hostess, arranging every detail with the precision of someone who cared more about appearances than relationships. Mary moved quietly through the dining room, setting the table for their lunch. She had become an expert at being invisible, blending into the background as if she weren't even there. It was safer that way. Catherine's moods were unpredictable, and today, she seemed especially tense. As Mary finished arranging the last of the silverware, Catherine strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her face was tight with irritation, and her voice, as usual, carried a sharp edge. "Mary, can you at least try to do something right?" Catherine snapped, eyeing the flower arrangement on the table. "This is a complete mess. Are you really this incompetent, or are you just not trying?" Mary's hands stilled for a moment. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself before speaking. "I'll fix it, Mrs. Harrington," she replied quietly, her voice calm but carrying the weight of years of suppressed frustration. "Fix it? You should have done it right the first time," Catherine hissed, leaning closer. "People like you. You're lucky to even have a job here." Mary felt the familiar sting of Catherine's words, but this time, something different was brewing. As Catherine turned and stormed out of the room, Mary glanced up and caught the eye of Sarah, who had entered the room with Michael moments before. Sarah's face showed a mix of shock and discomfort. She had clearly overheard the exchange, and so had Michael, who stood quietly by her side, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed Catherine's harshness. After Catherine left the room, Sarah spoke softly, almost to herself. "That was unnecessary." Michael nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I noticed that too. The way she talks to her." They exchanged a look before Sarah turned to Mary, her voice gentle. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes soft with concern. Mary, unused to kindness from anyone in the Harrington circle, gave a small nod, trying to maintain her composure. "I'm fine, ma'am. Thank you," she said, her voice even. But Sarah and Michael weren't convinced. As they sat down at the table, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than met the eye. Sarah, in particular, couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for having stayed silent as Catherine berated Mary. She glanced over at Michael, who seemed equally disturbed by the interaction. "I don't like it," Sarah whispered to Michael when Mary left the room. "There's something wrong with how Catherine treats her. It's too much." Michael leaned closer, his voice low. "I've noticed it too. It's not just today. I've seen Catherine do this before, and I've seen how Mary reacts. There's something off." Sarah nodded, her thoughts spinning. As she glanced back toward the kitchen where Mary had disappeared, an unsettling feeling took root. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but her instincts told her that there was something much deeper going on beneath the surface of the Harrington household. And for the first time, she began to question the dynamic between the Harringtons and their housekeeper. The Harrington mansion was quiet the next morning, save for the faint hum of Richard's office printer and the soft rustle of papers. Mary had always been careful when cleaning Richard's private study, moving with deliberate caution to ensure nothing was disturbed. She knew how particular Richard was about his space, and she respected that. Yet, today, as she wiped down his expansive mahogany desk, something unusual caught her eye. Richard had rolled up the sleeves of his shirt and left his jacket draped across the back of his chair, a sight that was rare for the typically polished businessman. As Mary reached to tidy up his jacket, she saw it, a small, familiar mark peeking out from the edge of Richard's rolled sleeve. A birthmark, shaped almost like a crescent moon, just below his elbow. Her heart stopped. The duster slipped from her hand and landed silently on the plush carpet. She stood frozen, staring at the mark as memories from decades ago rushed back with brutal force. She remembered that birthmark. Her baby boy had been born with it. It was a small detail, but it was unmistakable. It had been years since she had last seen it. But some things a mother never forgets. For a moment, the world around her seemed to blur. Mary's knees felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Could it be? Could Richard, this powerful, successful man, really be her son? Her mind raced with the impossibility of it all. But deep down, she knew. She had known for some time, though she had refused to let herself believe it. The resemblance, the little habits he had that reminded her of herself, the familiarity she felt every time she saw him. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the mark. How could fate have brought her here, to this very house, this very man? The son she had been forced to give up decades ago now stood mere feet away from her every day, not knowing the truth. The door to the office creaked open, and Mary quickly wiped at her face, regaining her composure. Richard walked in, preoccupied with his phone, barely noticing her presence. She quickly busied herself with the dusting, her mind spinning with the revelation she had just uncovered. "Morning, Mary," Richard said absent-mindedly, his eyes never leaving the screen as he sat down at his desk. "Good morning, Mr. Harrington," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart raced with a mix of emotions. Could she tell him? Should she? But how would he react? Would he believe her? Or would he think she was lying? What if he thought she was trying to manipulate him? The weight of the decision pressed down on her chest like a boulder. For the rest of the day, Mary moved through her tasks in a haze, unable to focus on anything but the birthmark and what it meant. The secret she had carried for so long, the truth she had kept hidden, was now too heavy to bear. She knew that the time to confront Richard was coming, but how and when remained a question she didn't yet have the answer to. The following days passed in a blur for Mary. Every time she saw Richard, her mind replayed the moment she had recognized the birthmark. The more she thought about it, the heavier the weight of her secret became. She couldn't avoid him forever, but how could she tell him the truth? What if he rejected her? What if this broke the fragile life she had built? But there was no denying it anymore. She had to tell him. It was late one evening when the opportunity presented itself. The house was unusually quiet, with Catherine away on one of her social trips. Richard was in his office, alone, catching up on some work. Mary stood outside the office door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times in her mind. But now, standing there, the words seemed to slip away. Gathering every bit of courage, she knocked softly. "Come in," Richard called out, his voice distant, absorbed in his work. Mary stepped inside, clutching the rag she had been using to clean, though her hands shook slightly. Richard glanced up, a little surprised to see her. "Mary, everything all right?" She opened her mouth but hesitated. "Mr. Harrington, there's something important I need to tell you," she said, her voice unsteady but firm enough to catch his full attention. Richard put down the documents he had been reviewing, noticing the tension in Mary's expression. "What is it? Something wrong with the house?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Mary shook her head, taking a deep breath. "No, sir. It's about you. And about me." Richard looked confused. "What do you mean?" She hesitated again, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. I know this is going to sound strange, but I believe I am your mother." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Richard blinked, his face unreadable at first, as if he hadn't fully processed what she had just said. Then, he let out a small, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "What? Mary, what are you talking about?" Mary's heart pounded harder. "I've kept this secret for so long, but when I saw the birthmark on your arm, the one shaped like a crescent moon, I knew. That's the same mark my baby had. My son, Richard. The son I was forced to give up for adoption all those years ago. I never knew where he went, but when I came to work here, I started to put the pieces together." Richard's expression changed from confusion to disbelief, and then something darker, anger. He stood up abruptly, pacing behind his desk. "Mary, this is insane. You're telling me you're my mother? After all this time? Why are you telling me this now?" His voice rose with every word, disbelief turning into fury. Mary felt a lump in her throat, but she pressed on. "Because I couldn't keep it inside any longer. I didn't know who you were when I started working here. But the more I saw you, the more I saw pieces of myself in you. In your face, in the way you talk. And then I saw the birthmark. Richard, I wouldn't make this up. I have no reason to lie to you." Richard's hands clenched at his sides, his face flushed with a mix of emotions he couldn't untangle. He stared at her, his eyes narrowing. "This is ridiculous. Why would you even think? Why would I believe this? I've been told my whole life that my birth mother was dead." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she stood her ground. "I'm not dead. I'm standing right here. I was young and poor, and they took you from me because they didn't think I could take care of you. But I've never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped wondering where you were, how you were living. And now I know." Richard turned away, running his hands through his hair. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but still full of disbelief. "Why should I believe you? After all this time? Why didn't you say something earlier?" Mary stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with the weight of the years she had carried this secret. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything again. But I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I had to tell you. You deserve to know the truth." Richard didn't respond. He stood there, staring out of the window into the dark night, his back turned to her. His silence spoke volumes, but for Mary, it wasn't rejection. It was the first step toward the truth finally being out in the open. Richard sat in stunned silence in his office long after Mary had left. The weight of her words pressed down on him like a heavy fog, clouding his thoughts and making it hard to breathe. Could it be true? Could the woman who had quietly cleaned his house for years really be his biological mother? The idea seemed absurd, yet the certainty in Mary's eyes, the tremble in her voice. She believed every word. And that birthmark? He had always known it was unique, but he had never imagined it could be a clue to his past. The next morning, the confusion still gnawed at him. Richard knew there was only one way to get answers, no matter how painful the conversation might be. He had to confront his adoptive parents, George and Evelyn Harrington. They had always been kind to him, raising him with love and providing him with every advantage. But now, a crack had formed in the foundation of his life, and he needed the truth. That evening, Richard invited them over for dinner, but the atmosphere was far from the usual relaxed family gatherings. As they sat around the dining table, the conversation was stilted, and Richard could hardly focus on the food in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest as he worked up the courage to speak. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad, there's something we need to talk about." George looked up from his plate, eyebrows raised in mild curiosity, while Evelyn smiled warmly, her soft blue eyes always so full of affection. "Of course, Richard. What is it?" she asked, her tone light but attentive. Richard hesitated, glancing down at his hands. Then, taking a deep breath, he let the words spill out. "Mary told me something yesterday. She says she's my biological mother." For a moment, the only sound was the quiet clink of George setting down his fork. Both his parents stared at him, their expressions frozen in shock. Evelyn's face turned pale, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard looked between them, searching their faces for any sign of the truth. "Is it true? Did you know she was my mother?" George shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Evelyn before speaking. "Richard, we didn't know she was Mary. We were told that your biological mother had died shortly after you were born." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached across the table to grasp Richard's. "We never meant to hide anything from you. We always believed what they told us. When we adopted you, we were told your mother couldn't care for you and had passed away soon after. We thought we were giving you a better life." Richard pulled his hands away, his face hardening. "But you never told me I was adopted until I was an adult. You let me believe that this was my whole life, my whole history. And now you're telling me you never checked to see if what they said was true? You just accepted it?" Evelyn's tears flowed freely now, her voice cracking. "We didn't know, Richard. We never wanted to hurt you. We thought—" "You thought what?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "That it would be easier if I just didn't know? That you could erase my past and everything would be fine?" George leaned forward, his tone firm but filled with regret. "Son, we never wanted to erase your past. We loved you like our own from the moment we brought you home. We thought we were protecting you from pain. We had no idea Mary was still alive, let alone that she had been working in our home." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling estate that had been his entire world. "She's been working here for years. And you never knew." "I never knew." George rose and approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Richard, we've made mistakes, but we love you. You're our son, no matter what. We raised you, and that will never change." Richard turned to face his father, his expression torn between anger and confusion. "I need time to process this. I need to figure out what all of this means." Evelyn wiped her tears, her voice soft but determined. "Richard, whatever you decide, we'll support you. If you want to know more about Mary, if you want to build a relationship with her, we won't stand in your way." Richard nodded, his heart heavy. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but one thing was clear. His life would never be the same. It was late in the evening when Catherine Harrington returned from her trip. She had spent the last few days at a luxury resort in the Hamptons, indulging in spa treatments and exclusive dinners with her high society friends. As she entered the grand foyer of the mansion, Catherine immediately noticed the tension in the air. Something was off. Richard, normally composed and focused, was pacing near the fireplace, his expression dark and brooding. "Richard," she called out, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she approached him. "What's going on?" Richard stopped pacing and looked at her, his face a mixture of anger, confusion, and something else, something Catherine couldn't quite place. He didn't speak for a moment, and the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Richard broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "There's something I need to tell you, Catherine. Something about Mary." Catherine frowned, confused. "Mary? What could possibly be so important about the housekeeper? Did she do something wrong?" Richard's jaw tightened. "She's not just the housekeeper," he said, his voice barely controlled. "She's my mother. My biological mother. Catherine blinked, stunned. What are you talking about? That's impossible. Richard turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. It's not impossible. It's the truth. She told me a few days ago, and I've spoken to my parents. They didn't know, but they confirmed that I was adopted. Mary's the woman who gave birth to me. Catherine stared at him, disbelief flashing across her face. This is absurd. How could this be true? She's been working here for years, Richard. If she's really your mother, why didn't she say anything sooner? Richard turned to face her, his eyes filled with frustration. She didn't say anything because she was scared. She thought I wouldn't believe her. She didn't even know where I ended up after I was taken from her. Catherine's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. So what? She just expects us to accept this story now? After all this time? Richard's face hardened, his tone turning cold. She's my mother, Catherine. I'm trying to process this, but I need you to understand that things are going to change. You can't treat her the way you've been treating her. Catherine crossed her arms, her voice defensive. Richard, I've never treated her any differently than I would any other employee. She's the help. That's her job. Is that what you call it? The help? Richard's voice was sharp now, laced with anger. You've been nothing but cruel to her, Catherine. I've seen it. I've heard the way you talk to her, the way you treat her like she's less than human. And now, you expect me to just ignore that? Catherine's eyes flashed with indignation. I'm your wife, Richard. I've always been here for you. And now you're taking her side? A woman who just shows up out of nowhere and claims to be your mother. Richard's voice dropped, cold and final. She's not just claiming it. It's true. And I'm not going to tolerate you treating her like dirt anymore. I don't care what your reasons are. You will respect her, or we're going to have a serious problem. Catherine's face paled. She had never seen Richard like this, so filled with emotion, so determined. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Her instinct was to fight back, to assert her dominance like she always did. But something in his eyes made her pause. He was serious. And this wasn't a battle she could win by simply dismissing his concerns. After a long silence, Catherine spoke, her voice quieter than usual. So what happens now? Richard took a deep breath, his expression softening slightly. Now, I need time to figure out what this all means. But one thing is clear. You need to change how you treat her. She's not just a housekeeper. She's my family. Catherine swallowed, her throat tight. She had spent years in control, always sure of her place in Richard's life. But now everything felt uncertain. She had no choice but to step back, to reevaluate. For the first time, Catherine felt like she might not have the upper hand in her own home. The days following the revelation were heavy with tension, but they were also filled with an unspoken hope. Richard had spent hours reflecting on everything that had come to light. The adoption he never knew about, the mother he had unknowingly worked alongside for years, and the way his life had been shaped by forces beyond his control. The initial anger and confusion had started to give way to a deep sense of curiosity. Who was Mary, really? What had she gone through? How had she managed to live with this secret for so long? Catherine, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, her sharp comments and constant criticisms noticeably absent. She seemed to be processing the shift in their lives in her own way, though Richard wasn't sure if she was truly ready to accept what had happened. But for now, his focus was on Mary. One evening, after Catherine had retired early to their bedroom, Richard found himself standing outside the small apartment where Mary lived in the Harrington estate. The light was still on, casting a soft glow through the window. He hesitated for a moment before knocking softly on the door. The door creaked open, and Mary stood there, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Harrington," she began, instinctively calling him by the formal title she had used for so many years. "Richard," he corrected gently, a small, tentative smile on his face. "Please call me Richard." Mary's eyes softened, and she nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The room was modest, far simpler than the rest of the mansion, with a small bed, a worn armchair, and a neatly arranged bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious life Richard had grown up with, and the realization that his mother had been living in such humble conditions under his own roof made his heart ache. "I wasn't expecting you," Mary said, her voice quiet as she motioned for him to sit. Richard sat down on the armchair, while Mary took the edge of the bed. "I've been thinking," Richard began, his voice heavy with the weight of the words he had rehearsed in his head. "About everything. About you. I don't know where to start." Mary smiled gently, though her eyes were filled with emotion. "I never wanted to burden you, Richard. I know this is a lot to take in. I didn't expect you to understand everything right away." Richard shook his head. "It's not about that. I feel like I've been living someone else's life. I never knew about you, about where I really came from. And now, I'm trying to make sense of it all." Mary looked down at her hands, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I've thought about you every day since you were taken from me. I wanted to keep you, Richard, but they told me I wasn't capable, that you'd have a better life with a family who could give you what I couldn't. And I believed them. It broke my heart, but I believed them." Tears welled up in Richard's eyes as he listened to her words. "You didn't have a choice," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what that must have been like for you." Mary's eyes met his, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, the silence between them filled with years of unspoken pain. "I was so afraid you'd hate me if you ever found out the truth," she admitted. "But I couldn't keep lying to you. You deserve to know." Richard shook his head. "I could never hate you, Mary. I'm angry at the situation, at how everything happened, but I don't hate you. I want to get to know you. I want to understand what you went through." Mary's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her hand trembling as she gently touched his arm. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you," she whispered. Richard, feeling the weight of years of separation and lost time, covered her hand with his. "We can't get back what we lost," he said quietly, "but we can start now. I want to know who you are. I want us to have a real relationship, whatever that looks like." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mary allowed herself to hope. She smiled through her tears, nodding as her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and joy. "I'd like that, Richard. I'd like that very much." The two of them sat there for a while longer, talking softly about their lives, their shared history, and the pain they had both carried for so long. For the first time, there was no formality between them, no employer and employee. They were mother and son, finally reunited after years of heartache. As Richard left that night, he felt lighter. The road ahead would not be easy, and there were still many conversations to be had, but for the first time, he felt like he was taking a step toward healing, toward understanding the part of himself that had always been missing. A week later, the Harrington mansion was the setting for a dinner unlike any other. Richard had decided that it was time to bring everyone together, to confront the past, to seek closure, and to move forward. The dining room, usually the site of formal gatherings and business meetings, was now a place where secrets would finally come to light and healing could begin. The table was set with the finest china, the crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier's glow. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Seated at the table were Mary, Richard, Catherine, and Richard's adoptive parents, George and Evelyn Harrington. The air was thick with unspoken words, and even the clinking of utensils felt like a breach of the silence. Mary sat at the far end, her hands folded nervously in her lap. It was still strange for her to be at this table as an invited guest rather than serving meals from the kitchen. Richard sat next to her, glancing at her from time to time, as if making sure she was comfortable. Across from them sat George and Evelyn, their faces lined with concern but also a quiet acceptance. And next to them, Catherine, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, her expression unreadable. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I wanted to bring everyone together tonight because there's been a lot that's happened recently, and I think it's time we stop avoiding the truth." George and Evelyn exchanged glances, their eyes heavy with guilt, but also a shared sense of relief that this moment had finally come. "First," Richard continued, looking directly at Mary, "I want to thank you for having the courage to tell me the truth. I know how hard that must have been, and I want you to know that I'm grateful." Mary nodded, her eyes welling up with emotion. I spent so many years afraid of this moment, afraid that you wouldn't believe me, or that you wouldn't want anything to do with me once you knew. Richard reached over, placing his hand on hers. I'm glad you told me. I'm glad we're finally here. The room remained quiet, everyone watching this intimate exchange with a mix of emotions. Evelyn spoke next, her voice trembling. Richard, we're so sorry. If we had known, we would have told you the truth from the start. We never wanted to keep your past from you. George nodded in agreement, his voice steady but thick with regret. You've always been our son, and that will never change. But we understand that you need to connect with your biological mother, and we respect that. Richard looked at them, his anger from the previous days softening. I understand why you did what you did. I'm angry about how everything happened, but I also know that you raised me with love. I don't want to lose that. I need to figure out where Mary fits into my life now. Mary smiled faintly, still trying to absorb the fact that she was sitting at the same table as the people who had raised her son. I don't want to take anyone's place, she said softly. I just want to be a part of his life, in whatever way makes sense for all of us. The room fell into a contemplative silence again. Then, to everyone's surprise, Catherine finally spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I haven't treated you fairly, Mary. I've been horrible, and I see that now. I didn't understand your connection to Richard, but that doesn't excuse the way I've behaved. I'm sorry. The apology, though unexpected, felt genuine. Catherine's face was pale, her usual confidence shaken. For years, she had built walls around herself, controlling every aspect of her life. But now she faced a situation where she was no longer in control. And for the first time, she was willing to admit that she had been wrong. Mary, who had long endured Catherine's sharp tongue and cruel treatment, was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, accepting the apology with grace. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. Richard looked between the two women, relieved to see this tentative step toward peace. What I want, he said, his voice steady, is for us to move forward. I don't expect everything to be perfect overnight, but I think we can start rebuilding, all of us. We're family in one way or another, and that has to mean something. George raised his glass, breaking the tension with a warm smile. To new beginnings, he said, his voice filled with hope. Everyone followed suit, lifting their glasses. To new beginnings, they echoed. The clink of the crystal a soft but significant sound in the quiet room. As they sipped their wine, the conversation slowly picked up again, this time lighter, filled with the possibility of healing. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more emotions to untangle. But for now, there was hope. A hope that they could redefine what family meant, not by blood alone but by choice, by forgiveness, and by understanding. Later that night, after everyone had left the table and the mansion had grown quiet once more, Richard walked Mary out to the garden. The night air was cool, and the stars shone brightly above them. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the soft rustling of leaves. I never thought I'd see a day like this, Mary said, her voice full of wonder as she looked up at the sky. Richard smiled, glancing over at her. Neither did I, he admitted. But I'm glad we're here. Mary looked at him, her son, and for the first time in decades, felt a peace she had long thought impossible. Me too, Richard. Me too. And with that, they began to walk forward, side by side, toward the promise of a new beginning. A week later, the Harrington mansion was the setting for a dinner unlike any other. Richard had decided that it was time to bring everyone together, to confront the past, to seek closure, and to move forward. The dining room, usually the site of formal gatherings and business meetings, was now a place where secrets would finally come to light and healing could begin. The table was set with the finest china, the crystal glasses sparkling under the chandelier's glow. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Seated at the table were Mary, Richard, Catherine, and Richard's adoptive parents, George and Evelyn Harrington. The air was thick with unspoken words, and even the clinking of utensils felt like a breach of the silence. Mary sat at the far end, her hands folded nervously in her lap. It was still strange for her to be at this table as an invited guest rather than serving meals from the kitchen. Richard sat next to her, glancing at her from time to time, as if making sure she was comfortable. Across from them sat George and Evelyn, their faces lined with concern but also a quiet acceptance. And next to them, Catherine, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet, her expression unreadable. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I wanted to bring everyone together tonight because there's been a lot that's happened recently, and I think it's time we stop avoiding the truth. George and Evelyn exchanged glances, their eyes heavy with guilt, but also a shared sense of relief that this moment had finally come. First, Richard continued, looking directly at Mary, I want to thank you for having the courage to tell me the truth. I know how hard that must have been, and I want you to know that I'm grateful. Mary nodded, her eyes welling up with emotion. I spent so many years afraid of this moment, afraid that you wouldn't believe me, or that you wouldn't want anything to do with me once you knew. Richard reached over, placing his hand on hers. I'm glad you told me. I'm glad we're finally here. The room remained quiet, everyone watching this intimate exchange with a mix of emotions. Evelyn spoke next, her voice trembling. Richard, we're so sorry. If we had known, we would have told you the truth from the start. We never wanted to keep your past from you. George nodded in agreement, his voice steady but thick with regret. You've always been our son, and that will never change. But we understand that you need to connect with your biological mother, and we respect that. Richard looked at them, his anger from the previous days softening. I understand why you did what you did. I'm angry about how everything happened, but I also know that you raised me with love. I don't want to lose that. I need to figure out where Mary fits into my life now. Mary smiled faintly, still trying to absorb the fact that she was sitting at the same table as the people who had raised her son. I don't want to take anyone's place, she said softly. I just want to be a part of his life, in whatever way makes sense for all of us. The room fell into a contemplative silence again. Then, to everyone's surprise, Catherine finally spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I haven't treated you fairly, Mary. I've been horrible, and I see that now. I didn't understand your connection to Richard, but that doesn't excuse the way I've behaved. I'm sorry. The apology, though unexpected, felt genuine. Catherine's face was pale, her usual confidence shaken. For years, she had built walls around herself, controlling every aspect of her life. But now she faced a situation where she was no longer in control. And for the first time, she was willing to admit that she had been wrong. Mary, who had long endured Catherine's sharp tongue and cruel treatment, was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, accepting the apology with grace. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. Richard looked between the two women, relieved to see this tentative step toward peace. What I want, he said, his voice steady, is for us to move forward. I don't expect everything to be perfect overnight, but I think we can start rebuilding, all of us. We're family in one way or another, and that has to mean something. George raised his glass, breaking the tension with a warm smile. To new beginnings, he said, his voice filled with hope. Everyone followed suit, lifting their glasses. To new beginnings, they echoed. The clink of the crystal a soft but significant sound in the quiet room. As they sipped their wine, the conversation slowly picked up again, this time lighter, filled with the possibility of healing. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more emotions to untangle. But for now, there was hope. A hope that they could redefine what family meant, not by blood alone but by choice, by forgiveness, and by understanding. Later that night, after everyone had left the table and the mansion had grown quiet once more, Richard walked Mary out to the garden. The night air was cool, and the stars shone brightly above them. They walked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the soft rustling of leaves. I never thought I'd see a day like this, Mary said, her voice full of wonder as she looked up at the sky. Richard smiled, glancing over at her. Neither did I, he admitted. But I'm glad we're here. Mary looked at him, her son, and for the first time in decades, felt a peace she had long thought impossible. "Me too, Richard. Me too." And with that, they began to walk forward, side by side, toward the promise of a new beginning. This concludes the story. If you need any further adjustments or additional content, feel free to let me know.